Welcome to CPF Fire Wire, a podcast from California professional firefighters where we discuss a wide range of issues affecting firefighters, our unions, our families, and the communities we serve.
Welcome to the CPF Fire Wire. I'm Brian Rice. I'm the president of the California Professional Firefighters. Today we're talking about an issue that continues to take too many lives of our brothers and sisters. It's an issue we've touched on many times over the years, and we're talking about suicide and mental health in the fire service. And for more than a decade, CPF and our partners, we've all worked extremely hard to break the stigma around mental health. We've built peer support teams and networks. We've focused on prevention strategies that protect the lives and wellness of our firefighters. And again, this September, during National Suicide Prevention Month, the California Fire Service Behavioral Health Task Force is calling on all fire departments to take part in a suicide prevention and awareness safety stand down. It's a chance to pause, reflect, and have honest conversations about mental wellness. Today, we'll look at how far we've come in taking this epidemic on head-on, where our challenges remain, and what it will take to build a stronger, more resilient fire service. And joining me today for our third edition is Alexander Hamilton, Fire Chief, Oxnard Fire Department. Alex is a national leader in firefighter behavioral health and suicide awareness and prevention. Chief, Alex, welcome back to the Firefighters. So happy to have you here. And for those of you that may not have caught the first two podcasts, take a minute and just introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. Well, first of all, Brian, thank you. It really is an honor to be sitting across the table from you again. So, as you can probably tell already from the accent, I didn't grow up around here, so moved here in 2002 after meeting my lovely wife. So she grew up in LA. So I was a volunteer firefighter back in Australia, and so when I moved here, it's what I wanted to pursue, and very fortunate to get hired with the city of Oxnard in 2005. It's been a phenomenal career. The fire service is an incredible opportunity to make lives better for people. Now, how I fell into this work and this role, it all started with a bad call, and it was a bad call on Thanksgiving Day with a pediatric call for a vehicle versus pedestrian. Pretty quickly, I came to realize that we didn't have the resources we needed. We started working towards that with the help of the IFF, and we started building a peer support team before they had the peer support class. We were one of the early beta testing locations for that. And then while we were going through that process, we actually had a member who was ultimately suicidal and in a plan. We were ultimately able to grab a hold of him, get him the support that he needed. He's doing great today. But all of that at the time, we did it all via text message only. We weren't even communicating directly. That was when we realized we needed more than just peer support. We needed these other components. That's how I got into, not only into behavioral health, but also into suicide prevention.
This is, and we're going to, you and I have been talking for a little bit here today, just kind of outlining the things that we want to talk about. I think both of us have figured out that we could probably host this for several hours. We're going to try to stay focused for everybody, but I would just ask, if you're out there listening, get comfortable and really take in what we're talking about, because you can be the difference, and we'll get there. But suicide is a really complex issue. Alex, can you talk about the duality in the process that can lead someone to the point of suicide, and why it's so difficult to recognize the warning signs in our brothers and sisters? And it's the complexity of it. And kick us off, the complexity of that process.
Yeah, it really is. Complexity is a great way to put it. Actually, duality is a really, really good way to frame things up, because on the one hand, people at risk of suicide or having suicidal thoughts, on the one hand, they yearn for connection, yet feel deeply isolated. They are having thoughts of ending their life, yet they have this deep ambivalence around dying. And so it really, they live in this state of turmoil. And so what that means in terms of looking for warning signs, they can be out there, they're really easy to miss, or there may not be any warning signs. And we just have to be comfortable with that. We're not gonna capture them all, but if you know the warning signs, if you can have the conversation, you can make a really meaningful difference.
And Alex, when you and I were talking, and one of the team members brought this up too, and I hear there's just little bits of wisdom all over around this conversation. And you said something I think that is super important. You may not know the signs. They may not be readily apparent. And it's kind of one of those that we talked about in hindsight or in after the fact that we've lost someone. And if you were close enough to do some reflections, you can see signs. But that doesn't mean you knew them ahead of time. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about a process that a person gets to when they are contemplating suicide. It can be very short-term and impulsive. It can be very complex. It can be a combination of both. And if you're confronted with that, one of the things that one of the team members said, and you said it because you were keying off it. If you're in a spot and you're having that conversation, do not think that other people are having it too. You may be the only one. And can you, in your experience, just kind of talk us through that and just how to be actively listening and paying attention?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, like when we teach suicide intervention, we talk about folks being in the river of suicide, and if we can't pull them to the riverbank, they'll end up going over the falls of suicide behaviour and potentially death by suicide. And so when we talk about those warning signs, the broad things you're looking for is behaviours, perhaps things that they say, various life events or their mood. Like there's these sort of broad categories you can look at. But the reality is, if you're able to have that conversation, if you get the opportunity or the privilege to have that dialogue, you need to assume you're the only person on the riverbank spotting that person. And because there's going to be plenty of people that person's going to go right by, and you're not going to be able to see them. And so that's where, if you get that opportunity, if you see something and you get to have that conversation, that's gold. Hold on to that conversation. If I could, I'll give a little example, because as humans, we're creative creatures. And so while I talked about there's this uncertainty and there's this ambivalence around this decision to die, that's what we want to hold on to. That's how those warning signs are getting out. It's the uncertainty that person's wrestling with. So I know as a firefighter, worked inland from where I work. I actually spoke to that individual 2 days before his suicide. I don't think I missed anything, but I stay up at night replaying that conversation. The reality is, though, on the day that individual died by suicide, he ran into his friend in the street, had a brief conversation, small talk, busy this, stress that. As they went their separate ways, this individual said to his friend, "I love you, brother." The guy said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, because in 50 years of friendship, he'd never heard him say that. Now, is that something you would connect to suicide? I'm not sure I would.
Yeah.
But I can almost guarantee that was that uncertainty coming out, and that was one of those opportunities. But again, I don't know that I would have picked up on that in that same circumstance.
It's as we were talking, it's a complex issue. It can be impulsive, it can be planned out, it can be a combination of both. And I feel like, and I'm not very good at it, and quite frankly, I think men in general suck at it. Mm-hmm. We suck at listening to others. Whether it's, seriously, whether it's our wife, my wife's probably at home clapping when she hears this. No kidding, you finally owned it. But in our profession, both men and women, I can only speak for men, because I am one, we are not the most intuitive creatures in the world. It's kind of counter who we are. And then throw in firefighters. Let's talk about that. And then the risk factors and the actually let's call it qualities our qualities as firefighters are our risk factors. In the fire service, the qualities that we live on, we're strong. And this is men and women, this is both. We're strong, we're tough, we're self-reliant, we're loyal. We keep our shit in here. And how do those very things that make us a good firefighter and good at what we do work against us when it comes to being mentally healthy? And in your experience, what have you seen and what are some keys to watch for, and then turn the table on that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. And it gets back to sort of what you were talking about earlier about this duality, right? Like, because as firefighters, we have these strengths, right? We take charge, we trust in our decision making. We are a proud group. These are all then become significant vulnerabilities if you get to a point where you start thinking about suicide as an option. And so when we talk about taking better care of ourselves, again, we suck at it. Like you talk about active listening. Since I've learned how to do peer support, I will tell you, active listening is exhausting. It takes a lot of work. You have to be very intentional. That takes work. That's partly why I think we're not very good at it. But if you can do that, and if you can get a hold of people within that turmoil, you can do a lot of good. But I think one of the things that continues to be a struggle for us in the fire service, as you talk about that pride and that self-reliance, self-sufficiency, is we don't want to burden people, and we don't, and so we want to keep it ourselves. But the other thing is, when you talk about self-care, we don't do that very well as a profession. We really don't, and it's been a journey for me. And I teach about self-care, and in the last 18 months, I used to say running was my self-care, and that was my meditation, and I realized that's not good enough. And so now I go to a yoga class once a week, and I'll do actual meditation, and I focus on what I eat, and at least consider how much and how often I'm drinking and those kinds of. There is so much more to it than just like checking in with yourself. How are you feeling? And acknowledge that we have stress and we carry stress. Whether we're coming home from the job with stress or whether we're going to the job with stress from things going on at home, acknowledge that. It's real.
And I want to hit a characteristic you touched, which again, many of us struggle with, men and women. And you talked about self-care, and to me, I call two people. When I'm at a spot like I'm in an oh shit position, I want to talk to you or I want to talk to Scott Ross. I need advice and things are happening that I'm not equipped for. But you talk about self-care and who we are, and talk about a little bit, how hard is it for you, as in my opinion, a leading expert in this discussion in the fire service, how difficult is it for you to have the discipline to do those things? And you know it. Yeah.
It's one of those things, and I actually heard this analogy the other day that I think really speaks to what we mean by self-care is, on the aeroplane when they say the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling and they say, put your mask on before you help somebody else. I think that's a really, really poignant kind of piece of advice as you relate it to this.
It's a great word picture.
It really is. And so, but we talk about self-care, again, because of that toughness or that pride, that it's the first thing you'll be like, no, I'm fine. I can keep going. It's just like, sure, I just went through my third SCBA bottle, but throw another bottle on my back. I can go back and keep working. We do the same thing when it comes to our mental health. And that's where we really need to take a time out, because you just can't keep going like that. And so, yeah, it has been something that's been a journey for me. And what's interesting, like within the classes that we teach, the IFF resiliency class is a great example. We talk about progress, not perfection. And even though I've been teaching that class for 4 or 5 years now, I've now come to realize that it's progress. And so it's making incremental changes that you can hold on to over time. And so I don't get to that Sunday morning yoga class every Sunday, but man, I'm better for it when I get there.
Yes, and it's interesting just to hear you talk about it, and I apply stuff like that to my life. And anybody that's listening, we all struggle with the same thing a lot. You know, our issues and the things that make them our issues are ours, and they're unique to us. But our process is super similar, and that discipline process. Changing gears a little bit. The task force is a decade old.
Yeah.
This is the third time you and I have sat and discussed suicide prevention and awareness. And the first time was 2019, so 6 years ago.
Yeah.
What do you see from the first time we sat and had this discussion where we both were going, you know, we're seeing 50 suicides a year. We're knowing people.
Yeah.
And reflect on the decade, but certainly the last 6 years. Where were we? Where are we? And where do we need to go? What do you see?
You know, I think we've done a tremendous amount of work, and I think we're starting to see that in the health of our fire service here in California in particular. And so I feel incredibly grateful for the work that's been done and the small role I've been able to play in it. One of the big things that I think has been accomplished, with your advocacy too, the presumption for PTSI, that was a huge step forward. Yeah. Now, to me, now from that, what I'm seeing is we probably need to revisit that, because one of the issues that, because if the only tool you have in your workers' comp toolbox is a PTSI hammer, then every nail looks like PTSI, right? So, but if we start looking at this through the lens of, depression, there's a really great analogy, or actually it's called operator syndrome within some of the special forces communities, and it basically talks about traumatic brain injuries. Now, if I tell you like traumatic brain injury, you think of a physical injury, getting knocked in the head, standing too close to a flashbang.
Exactly. Yes.
What we now know is that traumatic things that we see and experience does similar things to our brain, damages us in similar ways. And then, like after a concussion, you can suffer from depression. That's one of the injuries that you can get from a concussion. Experienced traumatic events can do the same thing. And so I think there is something that we need to work towards is broadening what can be covered under workers' comp. But more than that, because the workers' comp process, as we know, isn't great, isn't easy, is getting better medical coverage for folks that maybe don't want to go through the workers' comp process, and maybe they want to do it through their private insurance. They should be able to have that option, yet too often private insurance just doesn't cover these things adequately enough. I think there's plenty of work that we can do in preparing people for retirement, because this is a phenomenal career, this is a calling and a lifestyle for us. So what happens towards the end of that, and what are you going to do, and how do you prepare? There's things like that I think we can. There's still plenty more work to do, but I'm really encouraged about the direction we're headed, the conversations we're having, and I think the impact it's making.
Not only do we need to continue to do a self-evaluation on legislation and workers' comp protections, but we need to shift gears not only into our comp system and how our members are treated, diagnosed, and healed, but our health benefits too that are outside of the comp world.
The Center of Excellence out in Maryland, fantastic resource for firefighters. Again, it's out in Maryland. We need something out here. I know it's coming, and so that's going to be huge. I just recently got a presentation from the Institutes of Health from the folks down in San Diego. Part of that philosophy is taking a presumption on its face, and let's just assume this is work-related until it's not, and start treating that person. Just a game-changing sort of philosophy when it comes to workers' comp. And so I think things like that are incredible. More of those kinds of things we need, and again, the ability to be able to cover those things, not just necessarily workers' comp. Maybe people want to use their private insurance. So yeah, if that's a negotiating item for locals.
That's a great point. And for a number of reasons, including medically, whether it's you, your spouse, or your kids, you're probably going to be most connected to your GP or your primary care physician. And there's a lot to be said for what you just opened up in the not only in the conversation, but ideas, and to kind of make whatever fences or wall there smaller and smaller and eliminate them. And I'd never thought about that. The combinations of Alex, you're 100% right. Who knows us better than our treating primary care physician?
Yeah.
That is a big one. The other one, Institute of Health, that I think, and I know that you're already there, but I see on our horizon, there's a psychological part, the injury itself that we work with and we deal with. They focus on our social setting and our social network. But the one that I think our members know it, but for a different reason, nutrition. And when we think of nutrition, you think of lean body mass, muscle, all that stuff. But nutrition plays into our mental health too in a huge way. So I'm kind of excited to see how those three things can be used in concert going forward.
If you just look at 90% of serotonin and 50% of dopamine is produced in the gut. And so
Say that again?
90% of serotonin and 50% of dopamine is actually produced in your gut. And so that speaks to the importance of nutrition and having a healthy gut, because that all feeds, like you said, feeds your brain up here and makes for better moods and a healthier outlook. So it's important, it matters.
We could, on any of these things that we're talking about, we could continue the rest of our conversation. We're going to shift gears again, and these are all serious topics. But when you see suicide, the percentage of suicide by firearms is by far the biggest. And I want to talk about distancing a person from firearms and any means to follow through on a suicide, how important it is, what that means, what it should mean to you if you find yourself in a situation to intervene, separating a person from a firearm and how important that is. And I've listened to you speak on it, and please try to capture that.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to, again, there's sort of this thread of duality coming through this conversation, but this is a country that was founded in part on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. It's like firearms are going to be ever present in our society. And that's okay. But with that, we need to be able to, like you said, create distance between somebody that may be having thoughts of or at risk of suicide and that lethal means. And so one of the things that, there's a bunch that I want to touch on here, but when we talk about access to lethal means, that the impulsiveness that can come with a decision to move towards suicide behaviour, firearms don't give you second chances. It's incredibly lethal. And so if we can create, and that as simple as locking up firearms separate from ammo, even putting trigger locks within the firearms that are stored in a safe. The vast majority of gun owners don't ever think that they're going to use that firearm on themselves.
Right.
Yet all too often that's what occurs. And so you need to be realistic about that. The other thing that I wanted to point out though is that when we talk about somebody that's having thoughts of suicide, that risk profile can change from being a very minor thought to moving towards behaviours. But when they're in that zone of looking at suicide behaviours, it doesn't last forever.
Right.
That will subside. And so it's buying time for that to subside. It can pass within as little as 10 minutes. So we need to be able to find ways, come up with strategies to buy more time so they can get past this immediate crisis. And then we can move on to coming up with longer term strategies.
Yeah, Alex, you just hit on something, because I think most of us are trying to figure out, how do I understand this? How do I understand what happened with this person? Opportunity can lead to action. Impulse can lead to action. Touch on how just breaking that opportunity and impulse can change a life.
we see it time and again. If you get the opportunity to have, if you spot that warning sign, or if you just see that somebody is having a hard time, is depressed, have that conversation early about like, let's just remove access to lethal means while you get through this. Like, the sooner you can do it and get that person to agree that having that access right now isn't a great idea, the better. And then I think we all need to recognize in ourselves that thoughts of suicide is a natural human condition. When it becomes a behavior, then we have a big problem.
And talk about becoming a behavior. You're not necessarily talking about the actual act. There's behaviors that lead to that.
Yeah.
And as I was sitting here thinking and listening to what you were saying, and we talked about this earlier, we live, a person lives in isolation and all that. For all you know, Alex, I could be living in isolation right now in here, and that planning and all those things can take, I know that you've seen it take different forms. And a lot of us and a lot of people listening to this conversation is a mystery. And I think part of being able to relay that planning piece, it may not look like what you think it looks like. A person isn't living in that intense moment that I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And I'm trying to ask the question to just enlighten us, bring it a little bit more into light. Right. And you said it earlier, you touched on active listening and being an active presence in whether it's your crew or your family.
I've spent a lot of time like reading literature and learning more about this topic and everything else. And to be honest, in 50 years of work in the suicide prevention field, we have become no better at predicting who might suicide. We just haven't. And these are super smart researchers that are doing this work. And so that's where we look at these different risk factors, right? So intimate partner problems can be a risk factor. Experience in the military and being a military vet can be a risk factor. Financial problems. There can be a previous suicide ideation or previous suicide attempt can be a huge risk factor. But that doesn't mean that that person necessarily is going to be at risk of suicide, but it's something that we need to think about. And so getting back to it, like those warning signs, if they're exhibiting certain behaviors, if they're talking about loss or pain, where they're in a lot of pain or they want to avoid pain, these are sometimes cues that you can pick up on to have a conversation. Likely that overwhelming sense of pain.
I'm going to stop you right here just for a second, because not only saying it, but what you put in front of me and what made me really think is that being present. And a person may not say, I'm in pain, but if you're present with them, you're going to pick up things. And that's where I kind of wanted to that's why I stopped you. It's like, if you're listening, it's not always a person saying, I'm in pain.
Yeah.
It's how are they acting, and what are some of the things that might lead you to think, wow, this person's really struggling with this.
Yeah, and so often, what does that pain look like? Because somebody, like survivors of suicide attempts will tell you that pain is like no other pain that they've ever felt before. Like having a migraine headache and a jackhammer going off in your head at the same time. And so it gets to a point where like they're struggling to live, but they don't know how. Right? One of the things we talk about in our suicide intervention class is somebody with thoughts of suicide. It's like holding on to two incredibly heavy weights, and they're just there, like struggling. One of those weights is life. One of those weights is death, and they're just don't know what to do. And part of the conversation we want to have is just put the weights down. You don't have to make this decision right now. Like if you can have that conversation. The goal is not today. Let's just start there. Let's not today. And then we'll figure it out from there. And remember that, like we've already talked about, you got to assume that you're the only person having this conversation with them, but you're not alone. 988, the suicide prevention hotline, fantastic resource. Get them on the phone with the two of you if that's what you need. But if you can just get them to agree that we're going to be safe right now, you're already winning.
Nothing more needs to be said there. That was super clear, and thank you. Let's talk about fire department leadership. When we say that, a lot of times, most people think the fire chief or the administration. That's not always the case. We know that in the firehouse, leadership can come at many different levels, and it can come in different areas. And so leadership, if you find yourself in a role there, whether you're a company officer, whether you're at a larger station and you lead junior members, whether you're a battalion chief, an assistant, a shift commander, how does leadership play a role in this discussion within the department at all levels, and how important it is for each of us to realize our leadership levels in our organizations?
Yeah, I really appreciate you framing it up that way, because I think it is, certainly I have a big responsibility as a fire chief and in this leadership role, but leadership goes all the way through an organisation. And therein lies our challenge. How do we get everyone on the same sheet of music that psychological safety is a key component of our organisation, right? So it absolutely a strong labour management relationship, but it's also strong relationships between battalion chiefs and captains, like you said, with the informal leadership. These are where we get to we get to create a culture that values that psychological safety and values an opportunity to have these conversations. I think when we started this podcast, or we first did this back in 2019, there was probably a lot of agencies that if you ask them what happened if someone put their hand up and said they were thinking about suicide, take them off the job, right? In law enforcement, that's still likely a pretty significant issue in a lot of places. Now that's not the case anymore. Like, you may have to come off the job, you may need to go for some inpatient treatment, or not, right? But at least now we're having better conversations around that. But the other thing I think when it comes to leadership, and this speaks to both fire administration, fire chief, and union leadership, is making sure we've got resources in place. Clinicians that have experience with suicide intervention and suicide prevention. So whether it's cognitive behavioural therapy for suicide prevention, that's a modality that they can have. CAMS is another modality that we can use for folks that have had previous suicide ideations. So having some of those resources in place can go a long way to helping support our fire service brothers and sisters.
I do feel like we've removed some of the taboo from having this discussion, because there would have been, when I came out of the fire department, absolutely not. I can think of a firefighter, I never met him, I never worked with him, Ken Blythe. I came on in '85 and he killed himself somewhere prior to that. And I only knew about it because it was kind of mentioned in passing. And as we've matured organizationally in all levels, for me, that would be kind of my window and my look back on where were we, where we are. It does seem that we are making solid inroads on the removing the stigma and removing the taboo about this. And one of the things that I learned from you, and it wasn't through the podcast. I actually spoke to you. I have this situation going on. I need some advice. What do I do? And it was speak plainly and speak directly. If you think that a person is considering suicide, ask them. Yeah. Ask them just like that. Are you considering harming yourself? You don't have to be rude, but don't beat around the bush. Are you contemplating suicide or killing yourself?
Yeah. On that point, if you can't say the word suicide, that's okay. But you have to say, are you thinking about killing yourself? It has to be that clear. And a misconception that we have to get out of the way right now is that you're not going to give somebody the idea of suicide by asking them about it. Study after study, research has shown that that's simply not the case, right? The best analogy I've come up with, and it's not a very good one, is if I ask you to give me your next paycheck, you were telling me I'm dreaming, unless you're already considering giving me your next paycheck, right? And it sort of works the same way. You're not going to give somebody that idea. What you are going to do, though, is send a message that you're open to having a conversation around it. And that's more important. One of the things I wanted to go back to on leadership is, and leaders throughout an organization, like research shows now that perceived support from supervisors or leaders can significantly reduce PTSI symptoms. That's really important to know and to understand. And at the same time, though, I'll freely acknowledge, I'm sure there's people even within my organization that don't feel supported. And so it is a challenge. It is something that we have to work on, but it matters. And that support is really important.
That's a great message. And I'm going to dovetail on that because I really appreciated it. If you find yourself in that position to have that conversation, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? If you're the one that is having this discussion, I loved the fact that you said, not today. And that opens the door to get to a safe spot today and get more help. And that would, to me, Alex, and the things that we talked about today, I'd never thought about. I'm getting a little emotional, sorry. Yeah. Not today.
Yeah, it just simplifies things. And you don't have to have all that weight on your shoulders.
Yep.
We're just going to get through today.
I had to take a break. Give me a minute.
Someone told me that earlier this year, and I was like...
It's like that was a knife in the heart. Yeah. As soon as you said it, took my breath away. You know, this is a heavy conversation, and if you can't tell, I'll just own it. Yeah, it took me a second there in thinking about friends, people I worked with, people that I know, and there's always that application going on here, and it's an emotional conversation, and it's a serious conversation. I really appreciate being able to share with you. And it kind of immersed myself in the message. So I had to say, Alex, I appreciate it. It's heavy. As fire service leaders, what needs to be done to create a space or an atmosphere where firefighters feel safe and comfortable speaking up about their struggles, whether it's on the job, whether it's personal, whatever it may be? What can we do as leaders to support creating that kind of an atmosphere within the workplace and anywhere where we deal with our members?
Yeah, and I think this is where I think we've made a lot of progress, but there's still pockets that exist where we're just not hitting the mark. And so I think part of it as leaders, regardless of whether you're a chief officer, a company officer, a union leader, an informal leader within the station, just a person that your folks will listen to, it's being vulnerable, it's being humble, like speak with candor, and be clear, but you got to have some level of empathy. You know, I think that there is still some amount of bullying that still exists in the fire service. That creates issues for us, right? That creates this sort of institutional distrust that can really put up those walls or sort of shut down those conversations. And so dealing with that and being able to provide the space, like you said, provide the space for these conversations. We know that suicide doesn't exist in a vacuum in the sense that it was one particular call. That may be a big component of it, but it's more often than not, it's that plus these other life stresses and these things that go on that all contribute. Every suicide presents really unique yet really complex, complicated reasons, potential reasons behind, and unfortunately we never quite get the why on these things, but it's always unique.
You brought up the one, for me, most feared and dreaded word that I would physically fight physically tooth and nail to not participate in being vulnerable about anything, whether it's a workmate, work partner, my spouse. I I think that's kind of an inbred quality to firefighters. And for me, as I think back over the course of my career and everything that you just said, I didn't want anybody to know that I had human emotion or feelings. I would be cast as weak. I would be cast as untrustworthy. I would be cast as crazy or just that guy.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is, every single one of us have those traits and emotions and feelings in here. It's whether we choose to isolate them or we choose to use them or engage them. And my analogy is this. I loved your analogy of the weight, life and death. Those are the weights you're carrying in your hand. And I'm only asking you to put them down for today.
Yeah.
And I look at it and I go, we're all like a bunch of pinballs. You shoot the ball. Of course, this is 70 things, you know. But we do. We go. We're on the board. We're bouncing all over. We make points. We lose points. And sometimes more balls get put into play. And sometimes you get that bonus shot and you get shot again. But a lot of times you go down. And the question is, are you going to go down forever? And are you going to give in to that impulse and take an action? Or are you going to open up to somebody that might help you put the weight down?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you know, I have the privilege of traveling a lot, teaching a lot when it comes to this. I was in North Carolina last week teaching a suicide intervention class. And I got the distinct honor and privilege of being invited to the firehouse for dinner while we were there. And I can tell you, everywhere I've traveled, it's the same circus but different clowns. And we all have these real life events that happened. You know, I lost a friend to suicide last October, and he was in the behavioural health space and did that work. And, you know, part of my grieving process, I've come to realise that I put my family second too much in my career. And being able to say that out loud and being able to say that to my wife and kids, it meant a lot. It meant a lot to them. It was hard for me to do, but that's been part of my process. And so, but what I found is being vulnerable, talking about these things, talking about the experience of losing somebody who I work closely in the behavioural health space, yet I couldn't grab a hold of him. I think it's impactful for folks to hear those things. And
yes.
And the other thing I wanted to say, just because you mentioned the pinball thing and 70s, there's probably folks on here that are like, what's he talking about? Is understand that like different communication methods. Like I've had to learn this, my kids, they communicate way better via text than they do in person. Not always, but the same things that we're talking about here and having those conversations, you can do them by text. 988, you can text, you don't have to call, right? Like they have a text function as well. And so we've got different generations in the fire service and there's age-old conversations around generational differences. Maybe it's a text conversation. Same principles apply.
I love this part of the conversation because that's where I wanted to head to, was community, family support, how often it's overlooked. You just nailed that. And not only how important it is to build resiliency on the job, but at home too. And any insights on both of those or a combination thereof?
Do you know, one thing that and I've seen this now a number of times, and I think it's coming back, but I know, so when I started in the fire service, I haven't been in it that long, but when you started in the fire service, the camaraderie was different in the sense, like I'm going on camping trips and having sports teams, things of that nature. We're starting to see that come back. I think that's incredibly important to involve family, whether it's a day at the park, an organised day at the park with firefighters and their families, or a day at the beach, a camping trip, having organised sports and where you have team members. Doing those things can go a long way to remind us what we're grateful for in this career and to, again, it's building lives that you want to live. I think is a big part of this. But the other thing that I see is all too often when we teach these suicide intervention classes, it's not just around folks that brothers or sisters in the fire service they lost, but the deep losses from family and loved ones and close friends. If you look at it through that lens, take the fire service out for a second. Over 100 families today are going to grieve somebody that died by suicide. And again tomorrow, and again the next day. You know, this is a Thomas Joyner quote. He's like, I want to change that. We need to be able to change that. And so looking at it through the lens of knowing this better, understanding this more, you know, I think you and I spoke about it this morning. I've been in this field for over 10 years. 2 years ago, I had to have a conversation around suicide with my then 13-year-old son. Radically different conversation than any other conversation I've ever had about suicide. Folks need to think about that a little bit because it's really impactful, but you can make a huge difference.
You know, we're talking about wellness, mind, body, and soul, and nutrition, and what that means, and how it all fits together. Mind, body, and soul, our nutrition, our fitness, the kind of home life that we influence, and the type of home that we build. How we get the work piece, but we forget home a lot. It all fits together, but there's a part of me in the back of my mind that goes, your home front is just as important as your work situation, and probably for your stability at work, more important.
Without a doubt. I don't think any firefighter can do what they do without the supports outside of work, whatever that looks like. Whether it's a spouse and kids, whether it's your parents and siblings, depending on your age and where you're at in life, we can't do our jobs without those supports. And I think for a long time it was like, you know, what happens at work stays at work, and we can't live like that. Like we've seen that ends up creating these communication barriers that then become bigger and bigger barriers over time, because then you're compartmentalizing. Now, sure, there's certain things that don't need to come home with you and you don't need to talk about, but you can talk about what happened the day before, how that made you feel, whether it's frustration with the administration or whether it is that bad call and you saw something really traumatic that's impacting you. You need to be able to take those rocks out of the backpack. We need to be able to do that. But another key component that I think we need to talk about is sleep. Sleep is always going to be a problem, and good sleep is always going to be a problem for firefighters. There's just no way around that. Right. We are a 24/7 operation. But within that context, like we can talk about shift schedules, we can talk about changing what time we do shift relief, you can talk about those things. The reality is though, I think there's a much more impactful conversation around personal accountability when it comes to things around sleep. Going to bed and getting up the same time each day is just one important thing you can do. Cool, dark bedroom, really important. Like these basic things that you can do, right? I can't tell you the amount of times when I was out on the floor and we get a call at 4 a.m., get back from the call, and I'd be like, I'm up, let's put a pot of coffee on. And yet that, if I could have gone back to sleep and had those last 90 minutes of sleep, your REM sleep happens like the second half of your sleep schedule. So you may have just taken away 60% of your REM sleep. That's where we process all the emotional stuff in our sleep. Sleep is a very active process, right? So the less chance you get to process those emotions in your sleep, the greater likelihood it's going to be an issue for you if we keep piling that on.
It's stacking up.
It keeps stacking up. And so this is where, like, listen, we're always going to have these sleep impacts. So let's do everything we can to get the best we can out of our sleep. And so whether that's your first shift off, when you're on a row of days off, don't drink. Give your body a chance for recovery. The last day off before you go back on shift, maybe the same thing. So that, because alcohol doesn't help our sleep quality.
It's not your friend.
It's not. But again, we have sometimes a somewhat unhealthy relationship with alcohol. I know I'm now more conscious of it. And if I'm having a drink, when am I going to have my last one? And so I can try and get better sleep. It's important. And sleep is one of those things that it has this bi-directional relationship, right? Like bad sleep can create mental health issues. Good sleep can help reverse mental health issues, right? So it really does, it can impact where we end up landing. But I would say, and this is just me talking, that having the stress of the job of the fire service, plus regular life stresses that we all have, load on top of that, sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality, that's the recipe for bad outcomes.
Alex, you touched on it. When I came in the fire service, mid and early 80s, we came in at different spots, and our profession has culturally changed dramatically. And I think back to a couple of things. One was an incident that was particularly upsetting. I was a company officer. It involved a pediatric call. It was heavy on the family, and just the circumstances that surrounded it, it impacted me greatly as the company officer and my decision making and things that took place out of control, and the impact it had on a family outside of us. And I'll never forget going back to the fire station, and it was one of those calls that interrupt dinner. I went right into the captain's office, which, in the old days, dining day room office, there was a doorway, but I'll never forget this. My driver, I heard him say at the table, "Leave the skipper alone. That was a bad one." Mm. And I didn't say anything. He doesn't know I heard that. He won't even remember that. But what dawned on me was I wasn't alone. I did my business. I went back to the table, and you do your thing, and it was probably grotesque and didn't reflect what my internal feelings were. But I think about today's fire service. You go, you do your thing. We get on our phone. We get on our laptop. We go to our individual dormitory. How important is it that we make it a point as firefighters in the fire station to be as communal as we can versus isolating ourselves? And have you seen a difference with some of that natural isolation and privacy that we're moving towards?
Yeah, it's a new challenge for us. It really is. But with any challenge comes opportunity, right? And so it becomes more incumbent on the company officer, on the informal leader, to find ways to have more together time. Because the reality is, we've got to have individual dorms. Like we're a modern fire service these days, so We're not getting away from that. And so, but then how can you do that? What does that look like? And whenever I go and we teach these classes and we ask, it's amazing how many folks will put away the cell phones while they're eating a dinner together and things like that. And so there are even things going on right now.
You are seeing a move that way, yes.
Yeah, pickleball. Like playing sports together is hugely beneficial. So all of those things. The other thing I'll say too, Brian, to that call and like leave the skipper alone, that's fine in the immediate, particularly because the vast majority of the times those things won't stick, but you're not going to know anyway in the immediate. And so allowing someone to have a sleep or two under their belt before you, absolutely should have a check-in around these things. You can have a little tailboard, AAR or PIA or whatever you want to call it, right after the incident, but generally that's just what went well and what didn't. That's not how you're feeling or how it's impacting you.
Which in a million years, there's no way I'm unpacking that.
Right.
Yeah. But for me, it was that recognition. But when I think back on it, yes, he was protecting me. But the way we dealt with stuff then, it was protecting me from gallows and grotesque humor. Yeah. Which, because that's what we did. And we didn't know any better. And the other one, and I think it's important, and I want to touch on this, the Center of Excellence. We touched on the Center of Excellence in the IFF, and we send our members there for a myriad of issues: PTSI, alcohol and substance use and abuse, porn, sex, gambling, any of the addictions that plague our profession. And in working with the staff from the Center of Excellence, I heard a statistic that rocked me, and they said that a full 75% of our members that go to the Center of Excellence have diagnosed depression to some degree or another. How does that play in when we're talking about suicide awareness, suicide prevention? Depression is its own mysterious thing, and in everything that you have done, how much of it have you seen? Does it relate in there? How noticeable is it? Are there things to watch for in that arena that we don't even know about? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think that's one of those early key components. If you looked at sort of risk of suicide along a continuum, that would be one of the early ones that sort of can not always, but can send somebody down a road that they end up left untreated, left unaddressed, can lead them towards a road of potentially looking at suicide as an option. And so it is absolutely, I'm blown away that number is 75%. But when I think about it, I'm not surprised either. And so I think it's something, again, when we talk about that self-care and that emotional health, even in the context of self-care, most of the time when we say, like, when we teach these classes, we teach a 2-day intervention class that on the end of day one, you have to do self-care and you have to report back what you did the next day. Vast majority of people will tell you what they did for somebody else. That was their self-care.
Interesting.
That's not self-care. It feels good to help somebody else, without a doubt, and you should. That's why we became firefighters in the first place. But that's not self-care. And that's not really taking care. Remember, we've got to put our own mask on before we can help somebody else with theirs. And so when it comes to that, because I know depression can be hard to identify within yourself. And so that again becomes like, how can we help folks? As an organisation, one of the things we didn't talk about is doing an annual behavioural health survey and a check-in with a clinician. Seeing more and more departments do variations on that. Just like we get our blood work and annual medical checkup done, and I can tell you exactly where my cholesterol and bilirubin levels are, right? But how do you measure on that scale? Because that can be really important to spot changes over time, whether it's depression or substance use or misuse. Those things, we can help identify those issues earlier. And again, sort of stop that continuum before it gets too far.
I really like that, an annual mental and behavioral health survey. I think I'm pretty in tune, and I've never heard of that before. And I think that's, if you're listening, put an asterisk and go to your behavioral health team or your training or HR. That I hope, out of all the things that we're doing and talk about, I'd love to see that catch on and spread throughout the state of California.
And I would say, like everything, at least the philosophy that we have within Oxnard Fire Department, everything's voluntary. And the first year that we offered that as an option, 80% of our membership took that option. And it's completely anonymous. And they can do the survey and get the results and never meet with a clinician. Or if they want to talk about the results, they have the opportunity to meet with our clinician. So what's interesting, as
that in itself, Alex, brought it out 80% of the membership first time out. Took advantage of that resource offered by the department. I know you, so I'm going to guess that your local was probably involved with, I know how you do things. That speaks for itself, 80%. That should tell all of us. And Oxnard is a moderate-sized fire department. How many members?
135,
130. I was going to say 150. If you didn't hear that, I'll say it again. A voluntary mental health, behavioral health survey in that department that is evaluated by a clinician, first time out, 80% of the members. That should tell us we're on the right track, at least as far as behavioral health, suicide prevention, awareness. We're moving in the right direction. So, wow, that's a big deal. On that, I want to go back to, and maybe it's just me that's hung up on this, but we talked about isolation. Can you talk about isolation a little more? It doesn't mean that this guy goes home or this gal goes home or I go home to the basement or the back room with the shade drawn and whatever it is I'm doing in there. That's not what we're talking about. And if that is your picture of isolation, it's one form, but it's not right. Isolation, what do you see? What's your experience been?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that back, because when we talk about someone feeling isolated, they could have a fantastic social circle around them. Yet, and I think like examples are easy to identify when it comes to sort of celebrities, where they've got all kinds of fans, they've got all kinds of folks they interact with, yet feel incredibly lonely. And so, but we see the same thing, and it's something to keep in mind, where having those meaningful conversations, asking intentional questions, can maybe crack the door open to somebody telling you that they're feeling that alone, that loneliness or that isolation, right? Dr. Thomas Joyner, who I mentioned earlier, he has this interpersonal theory of suicide. So it's sort of three concentric circles that come together. Well, two of those circles, one of them is being a perceived burden, and then one of them is a lack of belonging. That lack of belonging is another way of saying lonely. Okay, so at the class that I just taught out in North Carolina, there was an individual in that class that lost a family member to suicide. And he said this guy was the gregarious one of the family. He'd come in and rub your shoulders and, check in with you and how you're doing. He was lonely within that space. It adds to the complexity, it adds to the challenge for us to identify folks that may be at risk. But it's another component to look at when you look at it through that lens.
It really speaks to just how complex we are as people, as individuals, our health, physical, mental, and how I think it really speaks to how important it is. And you said, Alex, and I'm hung up on it, and I'm okay with it. Active listening and active presence. Those two things, of which I'm not very good, and I struggle with. Those two things, if we could each strengthen ourselves and our characteristics in that arena for our presence with others when it's on the job or off the job, I think are probably two of the most important things that we can do to create an environment where our members, our friends, and our family will feel comfortable and safe saying, I need to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you'll know it when it happens, but just trying to slow down a little bit. We all live incredibly busy lives. We're always moving. It's really easy just to be all business, even with your families and, getting kids off to school or whatever it is, right? It could be all business, but actually stopping. How are you doing?
Yeah.
Actually just let's sit for a moment and just have a quick check-in. It can open the door to all manner of conversations that don't even have to be about suicide.
No.
But you can learn a lot about a person that you really love.
It goes back to that word that I talked about, that I'll do anything to fight not being vulnerable. And you learn a lot about yourself and others in that spot. And for me, dude, that is, I'd rather allow you to hit my thumb with a hammer than do that.
Yeah, yeah. One of the, a guy that I started in the fire service with, and we were on the same crew together for 10 or 12 years through various ranks. And he always used to say, humility's just waiting around the corner to shake your hand. And that is something that's always stuck with me. And as leaders, the ability to stay humble, be vulnerable, these are really important traits. of a quality leader.
Alex, we've talked about a lot. Ourselves, living in isolation, the members we work with. We've talked a lot about the effects, the cause and effect, but we never talked about a self check-in. And I know for me, early in my career, I alluded to an incident. It wasn't this, but it was the first time I went to EAP because I thought I was losing my mind. And this was in probably, it was 1989 or 90, and it was the first time we had an EAP program. And in my department, it was a 1-800 number. You know what we called it? 1-800 tell on your friends. None of us called it because we thought they were going to spy on us. Yeah. And I called it because I was having a hard time. What I learned was everything I was having a hard time with was normal. You just went through something, you saw something, you were part of something. You're not going to be able to sleep. You're not going to be able to concentrate. You're going to lose your appetite. You're going to be irritable. And the list goes on. And when I learned that, it really helped a lot, and it really helped me disarm that and talk about it in this forum. But I got to tell you, through the course of my career, and you have those things, and we all do, it didn't help me in the moment, except for me into my head basically go, I'm not fucking crazy. And so the check-in part, I never learned how to do that. You've done a lot of this, and if you had advice for our members on how to do a self-check-in, how to put yourself in a position to seek help and be successful in this arena, what would you tell? Here I am. I'm a 32-year-old firefighter. What would you tell me?
That's a great question, and I think where I'd start is that because of what we do in our first responder world, and we go on calls. How many anxiety calls have you gone on over a course of a career? Thousands. And yet, when anxiety happens to you, it doesn't look like that. And so identifying, better understanding what depression looks like. We talked about that earlier. What anxiety looks like. Again, acknowledging that you have stress. These things will build on you. But because we don't know what it looks like when it happens to us, I had an anxiety issue earlier this year where I was in a conversation with my wife, and my anxiety got so high that I couldn't get out of my own skin, and I needed to have the conversation end. And so I said horrible things to my wife to make the conversation go away. That was anxiety. I didn't recognize it till later, and I've been in this field for a long time. And so I think we need to understand that we get tasked with doing incredible things every day. We get that privilege. But with that, we have to acknowledge that it's going to put rocks in your backpack. And so learning more about yourself, learning when, so if you get home and you have a negative interaction with your spouse or your significant other, take a moment to reflect on that. Where did that come from? Because we want to say it's their fault, or it's something that they did, but a lot of the times it's not. And a lot of the times it's something that has come up. And maybe it's simply a lack of sleep, or maybe it's that terrible call and a lack of sleep. It could be all these things. So that's that piece of personal accountability and getting to know yourself better. And it's going to be a process, and it's going to change over time, and you'll see where, I didn't have a problem on running calls with kids until I had kids of my own. And then it became a huge problem for me. And so understanding that, and even, as I've gone from being a line firefighter and working my way through the ranks to now being a fire chief, I'll tell you that the stresses that I have now, how they manifest in me is exactly the same as when I was on the floor. And so I've had a really complex workers' comp case with an individual. I have nightmares about talking to that guy's son, just like I do when I'm from calls that we had when I was out in the field. And so your brain it learns how to do these things, and so you've got to be aware of those changes, and that takes discipline. And there's no easy way to figure that out, other than really stopping and reflecting on where you're at. Where is your head right now?
It's weird. I thought back to my career as a fire captain for 16 years, always worked on busy companies. You do your job, it's what we do. Do you know the most stressful job in my career was the very short window I spent as an assistant chief, as a shift commander, and then a deputy chief of operations. The stresses were not the same. In that, as a company officer, as a firefighter, an engineer, paramedic, whatever it is, you're in the field, you are making life and death decisions on behalf of people, others, every day. Whether you know it or not, you are. And I think back and it's like, here I was in an administrative job. Yes, it's fast-paced, whatever, it's high caliber, it's all that. It was the most stressful for me because it made me responsible for the men and women that I was charged to lead. And as I sit here thinking about it, and we talked about our recognition and stuff, and you talked about an exchange you had with your spouse and the stress and the anxiety, and I went, when we don't know how to cope with these things, our coping mechanism is always, it's an internal defense and it's ugly. Yeah. And here's the thing, it's a little ugly to us, it's really ugly to anybody else that is in our sphere of influence, which is almost always our wives.
Yeah.
And it's so important that not only to learn what the signs are, these things are going to happen to you. I don't care who you are, if you go through this situation, you can go to the bank on the following things happening.
Yeah.
It's more than just knowing that. How do you know it, acknowledge it, and put it to use in healing? And as soon as somebody gets the answer, I would love to have it. But it's a complex job. This is a complex issue, whether it's suicide awareness or prevention, and everything that we're talking about could be a piece in a suicide puzzle.
Yeah.
And whether you know it or not. And it could be stated as that for some people. It may never get stated for others. But really what we're talking about here, this is going to sound corny, it is. It's life and death for ourselves, our members, people that we influence. It's really important, and I cannot overstate how much work how much we've done.
Yep.
And recognize the wins. I think our safety net has smaller holes today than it did the first time you and I met, but we're not there yet. And the consequences of not being there for somebody could be life and death. I'm holding two weights, life and death. Can I put them down for today? That was super impactful.
Yeah, but Brian, you've also got to acknowledge your role in everything that you've done for the fire service in California, and how much, and I just need to say it out loud, the fact that you've put so much importance on it. You'll never know, but you've saved lives, and a lot of lives. And we've got more work to do, and yes, there is, there are still pockets, there are still issues. I did a suicide intervention on a firefighter on the Palisades fire, and got to learn that was one of those pockets where there wasn't enough resources and there weren't things in place that there needed to be. But again, we were able to identify that pocket. We were able to get things in place because the network's growing, the network's building, and I could make a phone call up to that area of Northern California and start getting stuff figured out. And that's because of leaders like yourself that have, and leaders that are within the Behavioural Health Task Force that are making these changes. We got to keep going. It gives me hope and optimism because we're heading in the right direction. Let's get more clinicians that are culturally competent. Well, let's start with clinically competent clinicians, and then we can teach them about our culture. But I'll take that first, and we can slowly make progress on all these issues. But I genuinely believe we're moving in the right direction, and we'll never be done with this work.
No. I mean, when we're having this discussion, there's just not a good time to stop. But I think we're at that point where I'm going to ask you closing remarks or thoughts that you want to leave members with for the month of September in Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month.
Brian, what I'll tell you is that we're not going to cure our way out of this crisis. It will always exist to some degree. But if we can take lots of little meaningful steps, remember it's all about progress and not perfection, and making little changes where we can, both organisationally, personally, will go a long way. And I think the one thing that I would leave you with is, we did this in our department a couple of years ago. It was actually for Mental Health Awareness Month in May, where we had shirts from the Till Valhalla project, and they allowed us to put Oxnard Fire on the shirts. On the front of the shirts it said, "Be kind." And on the back of the shirts it said, "Everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about." I think if everyone takes that into their day-to-day lives, I think we create for a better place.
Good words. As we close up today, Alex, I just thank you for your time. Every time I'm with you, I learn something. And I appreciate you. I appreciate the investment that you are and have made in the fire service and protecting firefighters and their families. Until we meet again, thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. And I'm Brian Rice, and this was the CPF Fire Wire.